Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Worldwide Clinical Trials, welcome to our webcast celebrating pharmaceutical discovery, development, and commercialization efforts in support of Rare Disease Day. Hi, I'm Michael Murphy, Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for WCT. And as you know, today, hundreds of patient organizations from countries and regions all over the world are supporting today's activities. In some respects, a celebration of opportunities, a conversation that we actually probably could not have had 15 years ago, with permissive science, innovative trial methodology, evolving regulatory sentiments, and increasingly sophisticated commercialization that are really prototypically present in orphan disease development. And there were so many topics that we could have presented, it became quite difficult for our organization to settle on only a few. Nevertheless, in a series of 4 10-minute presentations, we've elected to emphasize what I will call as reciprocal relationships, interdependencies across researchers, regulators, physicians, patients, family members, and payers that really are essential for successful drug device development and commercialization efforts. There are 4 presenters today. Sally Manuel, Senior Vice President for Study Startup and Regulatory Affairs, who will be addressing strategic regulatory and operational challenges associated with increasingly innovative therapy. Jeff Zucker, Vice President for Feasibility and Recruitment Optimization, who will examine the impact of patient and physician relationships and cultural rapport on successful trial conduct. Barry DeSalt, Senior Director, Project Management and Neurosciences, who specializes in the orphan disease space, we'll be talking about what we term methods of participatory research and the importance of family caregiver engagement in successful trial operations. And finally, yours truly, Mike Murphy, will be talking about those other stakeholders in the room and the need to demonstrate value when therapeutic novelty alone is not enough. With that as an introduction, Sally, may I ask you to begin?
Thank you. Now, although all drug development entails high levels of risk and investment, this is especially true in ultra-rare diseases. And these challenges include the need to identify sufficient number of patients to participate in clinical trials, which often results in large number of trial sites in multiple countries, since each may only enroll 1 or 2 patients, if any at all. There's the increased regulatory risks, and since there's usually no approved therapy for a given ultra-rare disease and no well-established roadmap for regulatory approval, this is a big challenge. There's the increased costs and risks of manufacturing ultra-orphan drugs, as often these are complex biologics. And finally, there's a challenge in terms of the need to engage in significant physician education, patient support, and post-marketing research once an ultra-orphan therapy is approved. So what I'm going to try and do with my slides is really try and present some possible remedies from a regulatory and organizational perspective. So the need to identify sufficient number of patients can be addressed through various pharma initiatives and patient advocacy groups. There are several agency initiatives, and a most recent example of the patient registries in Europe to support member states to develop comparable and coherent patient registries in rare diseases, parent joint action. And really through the use of key opinion leaders, including PIs and payers, patients can also be identified through the contact with international rare disease research consortiums, EuroDis, National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, that work to foster international collaboration and boost translational, preclinical, and clinical research in rare diseases. Regulatory risks can also be managed by early identification of organizational, methodological, regulatory, and financial challenges, with particular focus on the differences in the regulatory framework and the requirements such as translations, review pathways, and through understanding the documentation requirements, quality, safety challenges. Increased costs and risks of manufacturing can be addressed through successful filing of orphan drug designation applications with the Innovation Medicines Office of agencies such as the FDA, MHRA, and the Orphan Drug and Rare Disease Office. And the study synopsis and proof of concept feasibility trials can be used to aid in physician education and patient support, as many of my colleagues will discuss further. As there are a limited number of rare disease experts, some evaluators may not have the optimal understanding of the disease or the methodology used. Therefore, pre-IND meetings or scientific advice, if it's in the European Union, to discuss the methodological, safety reporting, quality reporting, administration and regulatory issues can facilitate smoother approval of the research trial. And of course, engaging into discussion with the FDA as regards to an accelerated NDA approval and agreeing on the clinical development plan and filing of an IND will greatly assist in addressing all of the four main challenges that I mentioned at the start. So over the past couple of months, WCT's had two similar requests from different sponsors wishing to conduct ultra-orphan disease trials that I'd like to share. This is how to facilitate cross-border transfer of patients to bring them to treatment for research purposes. In one of these specific cases, the company had a gene therapy product for the treatment of an ultra-orphan disease. Their product was only available in the United States, and furthermore, the nature of the assessments for the illness required expertise existing only at one center in the U.S. The company wanted to transport the patients to this site in the U.S., where the therapy would be administered, and then have the patient return to his or her native country. Periodically, the patient would be required to return to the U.S. for specialized assessments, while in their country of origin, the patients would only have administrative and other routine safety assessments performed. Target regions for accessing patients included Latin America, the EU, and possibly within Asia. Now, transporting patients for treatment poses a number of challenges, but it's possible, as has been showcased by the Progeria clinical trial that started in 2007, where 28 children from 16 countries participated in a trial requiring them to travel to Boston every 4 to 6 months to receive treatment. Now, there are lots of considerations with such a campaign, and the obvious is, of course, the financial aspects relating to the cost of travel, the arrangements of necessary visas that must be met for the patients as well as their carers and their next of kin, accommodation costs, etc., as well as the cost of having certified translations services available at the site. There are also the risk-benefit assessments that must be weighed, such as the potential reluctance from the local doctors to enroll patients that will receive treatment outside of their jurisdiction, not to mention the ethical considerations of transferring patients that must be addressed in light of locally existing treatment options. Data transfer requirements, including translation of medicinal records, data protection compliance requirements also need to be considered. And of course, there are the regulatory procedures such as the competent authority submissions and ethics submissions that need to be managed in both countries, including the management of the informed consent to consolidate and incorporate the requirements and comments from all the reviewing authorities in the two countries. Given all the country-specific nuances and the already disproportionate effort and costs needed to launch orphan disease trials, it's further amplified when implementing a cross-border patient transfer strategy. So to assist in reducing the costs and the time involved in initiating such trials, there are various steps that could be recommended, and I'll begin first looking at Europe. There are currently two routes for gaining clinical trial authorizations in Europe: the national submission route, requiring submissions to each individual member state, and the VHP, or centralized route, and this is soon to be replaced with a new directive in October 2018. We would recommend the VHP procedure. This procedure involves a series of stages, beginning first with centralized application for all member states review, and then once approved, followed up with a local or national application to each member state concerned. The benefits of this submission and review of the protocol and technical dossier can be made well in advance of potential investigator and even patient identification. And through the submission route, it can be quickly determined which national member states in Europe are likely to reject the study involving patient transfer to the US, and which countries will be open to the review. It also provides the opportunity to address technical questions at one time at a European level, rather than having to go multiple times back and forth with the individual member states. Once VHP approval is obtained, the application will need to be made to the individual member states, including ethics committees, before the patients can be enrolled into the study. So this option really provides the opportunity for early indication of the agency's sentiments with regards to the trial design prior to incurring country-specific regulatory submission, preparation and translation costs. And more importantly, the opportunity to explore the concept of conditional approval based on the provision of site-specific details at a time when patients are identified. So with this European strategy, it would be worth querying with the authorities as to the acceptability of gaining the research approval for pre-approved, ready-to-go reference sites through a single application made to the authorities via a known centre of excellence without necessarily submitting all documents for these reference sites at the time of the initial application. And oftentimes, insurance requirements are not really discussed until much later in the submission preparation stage. However, for these types of studies requiring swift and urgent action, we'd recommend partnering with a global insurance broker and discussing the trial features as early as possible, as it creates another level of complexity. Equally, having access to global translation vendors of very high quality is also key to facilitating a rapid submission and response to agency questions. The same principles apply in Latin America in terms of negotiating conditional approvals where possible. However, unlike in the EU, where it's advisable to reduce your costs by waiting for VHP acceptance before preparing submissions, in Latin America it would be advisable to arrange the protocol and IB translations as early as possible to facilitate the submission and negotiation activities. And as contracting requirements in this region are particularly challenging, even across sites within a given country, it would be advisable to begin working on developing a master contract template tailored for the Latin American region and ensuring that these are also discussed with the US sites in advance. In Asia's Pacific region, many centres are affiliated with US centres, and therefore there might be an opportunity to negate the need for additional IRB or ethics approval. But more importantly, having FDA endorsement in the context of a pre-IND meeting and having agreed on the protocol design and the clinical development plan significantly increases the chances of having a favorable regulatory assessment. Asian countries, for example, as India, Israel, and even Japan, due to their increased collaboration with the PMDA and the FDA, really do weigh the contributions from the FDA and certainly from the EMA scientific advice. Rare disorders often present unique public health challenges. Clinical development of orphan drugs and drugs that address ultra-rare diseases entail big difficulties. And the previous slides portrayed a fragmented regulatory framework. Therefore, strategic regulatory affairs planning is key not only to minimize the timelines and enabling cross-border transfer of patients, but also to ensure successful execution of the clinical campaign. Strategic planning can help to organize a meaningful pre-IND scientific advice meeting and set the foundations with the agencies on the clinical development plan. It can help to identify early in the process differences in the regulatory requirements and to select countries based, of course, on the prevalence of the rare disease, but also on the pragmatic and operational capabilities. Once potential patients are identified, rapid response and reactivity are crucial to avoid protracted review and approval timelines. And finally, as with any clinical development exercise, keeping the end of the accelerated NDA is crucial, especially in the case of unmet medical diseases and underrepresented patient groups. Together with a team of cross-functional experts from medical and scientific affairs and biostats, medical writing and others, truly global regulatory experts who can leverage their knowledge of different country regulatory pathways to navigate the regulatory hurdles can add significant value in successfully managing the complexities of rare or ultra-rare studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. This is Jeffrey Zucker, and I wanted to thank all of you for joining this important talk today on Rare Disease Day. I wanted to briefly review with you some specifications regarding cultural, site, and patient considerations for conducting rare disease trials. In some, even many ways, they can be very similar to trials in more common diseases, but there are some key components that need to be taken into account when you're when you're evaluating and implementing rare disease studies. To begin with, even more so than in other trials, the study needs to be very tailored to the patient and to the site population. These patients and caregivers are typically quite educated on their disease, and the bond between physician and patient can be quite strong. With that in mind, there must be strong engagement and buy-in from investigators to ensure successful patient recruitment. This engagement should occur at the earliest time possible from the sponsor and CRO to ensure that the investigator feels engaged and is holding some power with the protocol, and thus passing that along to their patients. Much like oncology trials, the largest draw is a compound that is novel and has promise to help their patients. If the compound is attractive, investigators will have a high level of interest. Subsequently, patients will share the motivation to participate. It is important to note that rare disease patients and their families are willing to be inconvenienced more than typical study patients. However, it is vital that we provide services to minimize the inconvenience and also ensure that there is small to no cost to the family for study participation. This was outlined earlier in some of Sally's slides, talking about transportation from one country or one region to another. Engagement of KOLs is usually a good idea for many clinical trials, but for rare diseases, it's absolutely essential. More often than not, rare disease physicians and investigators know each other globally. If we do not proactively engage the most influential KOLs, the study will fail. We also need to determine the cultural relationship between these KOLs and the networks. Is it a network that works closely together and collaborates? Or there are some that are based a little bit more on competition between the investigators. We want to test that culture out to make sure that we're reaching out in the most proper way. Instead of doing a general outreach to the first KOL that we come across, because one false initial step may disengage some KOL networks altogether. Finally, but most importantly, sponsors play a key role in these investigator engagements. CROs are great operational partners, but sponsors that develop medications for rare diseases are typically also very passionate about the disease and, of course, their compound. The CROs can help facilitate these interactions, but early, frequent, and directed sponsor-to-site contact is essential. In assessing sites and the feasibility of a given protocol, we need to evaluate the environment. This starts with a full detailed assessment of the incidence and prevalence data and competitive environment with other clinical trials and also standards of care throughout the globe. When evaluating these items for rare diseases, the data oftentimes is a little harder to find, but it is also extremely usually comprehensive and accurate. Individuals studying and writing articles regarding rare diseases are again usually quite passionate and may even focus a large portion of their work on the disease and its study. It is important that the sponsor and CRO have data-driven analysts available for these searches and evaluations. Each group needs to have expert folks that know how to look at data, know how to evaluate data, and make it directional, and be educated before interacting with some of the KOLs and sites. The industry has been speaking about patient centricity and the need to find patients. This is even truer in rare disease trials. We need to do our best to go where the patient is. There may or may not be a geographical concentration for some rare diseases, and we need to identify this quickly to ensure we're reaching out to the right places to find the right sites and subsequent patients. With evaluating the sites, they may have patients and may have the expertise in treating them, but we need to make sure they are also research capable. Since we are going where patients are, we may encounter many sites that are industry research naive. In these cases, we have choices. One choice is to make the site research equipped. and get them up and going and providing them the training that they need. This obviously takes time and effort from the CRO and the sponsor, and also introduces some risk in conducting a vital trial with a new site. But can also, and I have found it many times in the past, be very rewarding. Alternatively, again, we could provide services for these patients to be transported to the closest research facility. That does work in the indication, much like Sally had described earlier. Physician referral programs on other trials that are not rare diseases, typically it can be a hit or miss. And again, it is very indication and regionally driven activity. However, we found that referrals in rare diseases are typically more accepted, as the physicians are normally seeking the absolute best and cutting-edge treatment for their patients. Finally, we need to assess the regulatory environment and KOL culture. Much of the regulatory discussion was just covered by Sally, but it is important to take this into consideration when developing your final site and country mix. At all of these levels, the cultural component needs to be considered. As I mentioned earlier, taking into account the KOL culture is important to understand prior to engagement. Spreading culture a bit deeper, it needs to be evaluated among investigators, communities, patients, and families. A recent example I have was in evaluating a program for sickle cell disease. This is a rare disease that has a clear targeted population of African descent, so we wanted to evaluate the incidence and prevalence in and around the region. We found high incidence and research history in some of the Caribbean islands, specifically Jamaica. Although centers in Jamaica have done research in the past, it's not a frequent destination for clinical researchers when they initially think of looking at places to conduct their trials. We wanted to find out more. So we consulted with local experts, and this slide shows some of our findings. Many of these are true for other regions and types of trials, but there is a heavy emphasis on these items when relating to rare disease trials, specifically sickle cell disease. To begin, there remains strong caution towards clinical trials and the idea of being treated like a guinea pig. Although the stigma continues in other parts of the globe, it is specifically prevalent in the Caribbean region. This belief also is quite prevalent in the United States with African Americans, where the industry continues to struggle to engage this population in clinical trials, and this is one of the driving reasons why. We're still seeking to educate the population on clinical trials and help them understand the potential benefits in short and long term. But this is something that takes a combined effort with the industry representatives, and it will take time. Recently, some sponsors have started to thank clinical trial participants at the end of their commercials for marketed drugs. This is one small step in raising awareness, and it should continue to grow. Recognition of study participants is a point where the industry has not been very efficient. We need to continue to create new ways to recognize these individuals and their important contributions. Another important factor that we discovered is that local sites and investigators in the Caribbean region are quite weary of working with big pharma. There's not a lot of research going on through this region, so their experience in working with different sponsors is not great, as it is in other regions such as North America and Western Europe and things like that. When they are part of a global trial, they are frequently uncomfortable with the thought that they should be treated like every other region. Moreover, the lack of personal touch in situations like this is counterintuitive to their culture in the Caribbean. So they are aware the industry is seeking less and less expensive regions to conduct trials, and quite frankly, they believe that this is the driving force behind involving them. Thus, for success in working in the region, there needs to be that direct communication I discussed earlier. For a trial like my example of sickle cell, this region would be a large contributor. So it's natural that we would automatically have early and often communication with them. but it's important to note when they are a country in a global trial, including 10 to 15 other countries, it is just as important to engage them in the same fashion. Finally, we need to identify the KOL for sickle cell in the region and engage him first. From there, we were able to use a hub and spoke model would help us drive much of the local engagement and communication with other investigators. We were told that without this engagement, the trial would not be accepted in the region. In regard to logistics, we found out there were 3 main islands with capability to conduct trials: Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados. Through our earlier discussions, we could implement a service to transport patients back and forth within the islands, but these were the 3 main islands that had research capabilities that could support us for our sickle cell study. We also learned that the retention rate is exceptional. This is driven by the investigator-patient relationship and the physician's strong presence within the community. This level of trust is high and leads to a strong belief that their caregiver is looking out for the patient's best interest. We see similar levels of investigator-patient engagement in Latin America. Finally, it is important to note that most of the researchers have been trained in the U.S. and Europe. They do this to dispel the belief that the investigators do not have the experience and training to conduct a proper trial and to gain deserved respect for research within the region. I thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it along to our next speaker.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Barry Dussault, and what I'm going to speak about today is really a complement to what my colleagues Jeff and Sally have already spoken about regarding the models of participatory research and the importance of family and caregiver engagement in these indications. Depending on who is doing the counting, there are between 5,000 and 7,000 distinct rare diseases. It almost goes without saying that we can't approach all of these diseases like a phase 3 asthma study. And it almost goes without saying as well that we are not experts in any one of these indications. So how do we approach these? We approach these by drawing upon the commonalities that we can find amongst these distinct and rare diseases. And by applying some scientific, operational, and regulatory experience and expertise, we can make each of these studies a success. We have found that understanding the disease characteristics, such as the subtypes and or variants in these indications, the disease trajectory, when does it start and how does it end, standards of care that are typically applied in these indications. As Jeff has just spoken about, the patient management and referral pattern. And for me, what is the most important bullet on this slide is family dynamics and the sentiments regarding research. In many indications, these families and the patients are smarter than us regarding their disease. We need to take that into account when interacting with them, both at the site level and at the CRO level, and as Jeff has mentioned, even with the sponsor. Engagement of rare disease networks and key opinion leaders, which we're going to speak about more on the next slide. As Jeff has already mentioned as well, the use of hub and spoke referral patterns to optimize patient accrual. Operational support for less experienced sites and PIs. In many instances, the sites that we are working with are research naive, and by definition, we need to go where the patients are. Therefore, as Jeff has already mentioned as well, in many instances, the CRO and the sponsor need to work with the site to bring them along on GCPs and educate them as to how to conduct research. And finally, taking into account the family burden that is imposed upon the families, the patients by the protocol visits, and the assessments that are indicated in the protocol. This is part of an overall principle we have regarding design and operations and the need for the two of them to be intertwined at all parts of studies during rare diseases. We've heard anecdotes from engagement with patient advocacy groups of, excuse me, in certain indications of patients being asked to do a walk test first thing in the morning per the protocol. And that is in neither the site's best interest nor the patient's best interest, as in the morning they can be quite stiff. It is instances like those that need to be taken into account when the protocol is designed. And we can do that by engaging with patient advocacy groups. As they say, rare diseases are rare, but rare disease patients are quite numerous, and the same can be said for patient advocacy groups. Most often these are started by a caregiver or a number of caregivers who have bonded during treatment for their children and or the patient under their care. And they usually expand to include doctors, physicians, KOLs, and whatnot in each of the indications. And by engaging with these and talking to each of these advocacy groups, we can learn what is important for each disease, what affects the patients, and what is important to the caregivers that surround those patients. It is really important to engage with them, reach out, and especially if there's a protocol that is in the process of getting started, getting buy-in on the design of that protocol, as we've mentioned, is very important. In a lot of cases, they are smarter than we are about the disease, and we need to take that into account when speaking with them and not dumb down the science, especially don't speak down to them. It's very important to engage them as equals. In working in these diseases, we can suggest some best practices regarding the staff. Again, we can't approach these as a large global phase 3 asthma study, for instance. There need to be some attributes that are applied to the staff to help ensure success. In general, involvement in the indication. Again, engagement at the entire team level, perhaps, with those patient advocacy groups. It's important that each member of the staff receive therapeutic area training. In this way, they can get information regarding the disease biology, the specifics of the intervention, and again, at the design of the study that is being applied. It is important to arm the team with enough information to be a good colleague and perhaps even to be dangerous, so they know which questions to ask at the site level and during the study design process. The clinical research associates. Ideally, they would have previous experience in rare and orphan diseases, and whenever possible, we have found that it's beneficial to assign staff that are Bachelor of Nursing, registered nurses, and or sometimes internationally physicians as well. And even at the project management level, it is beneficial if the project manager and or the project director can come from a scientific background and are therapeutically aligned within the disease area that is being studied. In this way, we can make sure that the staff is engaged with the study and, importantly, they find it intellectually stimulating. Recruitment and retention in rare diseases also requires a different approach. In many cases, we are not recruiting the patient in these studies. You are recruiting the network around that patient. Again, as has been emphasized throughout this discussion today, these are very educated families, something to keep in mind when designing the ICF, for instance. In many cases, they will require site-specific planning, and in many cases as well, the site will have their experiences to share with us. Again, engagement with the patient advocacy group in that particular disease is incredibly important. And as far as retention, as my colleague Jeff has spoken about already, the support for the patient caregiver travel. In many cases, a patient will spend 2 hours getting back and forth to a site up to 12 times a year to participate in these studies. Anything that the study team the CRO, the sponsor can do to take that burden off of the patient and the caregiver, and in many cases remove it completely, will benefit retention and increase study outcomes. Again, to summarize, working in these diseases is important that design is integrated with operations. We need to take patient and caregiver experience into account when designing the study. We need to consider what is important to the subjects and their caregivers, especially when designing the endpoints. Vice versa, operations need to be closely integrated with the study design, while also integrating logistics and support for the patient caregiver when it can benefit the participants. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. It's Mike Murphy again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to speak about the importance of the other stakeholders in this process. These are the other colleagues, other groups and individuals who increasingly require that those of us responsible for design, execution, analysis, and interpretation demonstrate the value of the novel therapeutic entity as part of the development process when novelty cannot be enough. It's incumbent upon those of us with this responsibility, therefore, to generate data that will resonate in a very diverse group of stakeholders to assure three things. First, appropriate medical use. Two, unencumbered patient access to therapeutics. And three, a description to describe the potential impact of that therapy on a system of care. Indeed, the environment that we work in is remarkably complex. All of us recognize this mosaic: care providers, physicians, disease management specialists, Medicaid, Medicare, commercial plans, pharma, policymakers, and government. Each of these entities has a singularly unique perspective regarding the framework of healthcare as they would see it. They have unique investments in our efforts in drug discovery, development, and commercialization. It's neither orderly and, in my experience, not always rational. But the important point is that multiple stakeholders impact research and development efforts with conflicting and diverse data needs. Acknowledging these needs as part of a prototypical registration process is part of the current environment in the orphan disease space. And we've seen the press because we need to influence the access as well as the approval. Here we have in the upper left-hand corner of this slide the first marketable gene therapy product at an estimated cost of £870,000 to treat a single patient. A discussion in the middle there, should in fact we even consider value-based assessments in the orphan disease space? The answer is yes. What about our ability to estimate economic value and burden when the disease is rare, there's significant disease heterogeneity, and the pathway is uncertain? Our need, ladies and gentlemen, is to influence policy, to influence how commercial and governmental insurance plans view the clinical data that we generate, because each of these individuals has an important stake in this particular process. And in some respects, we are translators. We are intermediaries in this process. We need to generate real-world evidence in rare diseases. For example, things that we'll notice about the space currently: significant scrutiny prior to commercialization. I would argue any product that's north of $50,000 a year per patient is going to get the attention of different groups in this space. All realize there is considerable latitude in pricing for these agents, but that the linkage to the value is unfortunately uncertain. They recognize that the cost of promotion of the product is usually nil, and that in the United States, off-label use is extremely common. Interestingly, some of the groups are very anxious about what I call care transitions, pediatric to adult transitions from one specialist to another because the burden of care and the economic impact of care will vary across the spectrum of these specialists. They're concerned about balancing both equity and market dynamics. And certainly it isn't equal in the United States compared to the EU. And even when the product is approved and is on formulary and reimbursed, frequent reevaluations will occur following a typical registration program. Does the intervention perform as advertised? Is the effect persistent and meaningful through time? Some of the gene therapy products create some very interesting challenges in that regard. As you know, there are many control mechanisms in place which will dictate patient access. But it is an environment, and the good news for us is data rules. They're awash with opinion. What we need to do is be equally creative with the data. And so prior to registration in the pre-market launch setting, companion observational research studies that perhaps look at burden of illness, treatment patterns and transitions, competitor products and interactions, methods of disease management. Again, the emphasis is on the impact of novel therapy on a system of healthcare as a part of patient management. An example I thought would be interesting would be idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. On the left-hand side, we have typical sentiments from patients who are burdened with this disease. These call-outs are very informative, very expensive, inconsistent guidance between Medicare Part D and private insurance. The economic burden on the family, I think, is considerable for these medications. As a clinical trialist, as someone who's responsible for designing these programs, then what do we need to attend to? First, we need to note there's possible significant barriers in the United States market possible as these new products will be approved. Not inappropriate barriers, but barriers that need to be addressed with clinical trial data that speaks beyond the efficacy and safety of the product into the value of the product. There are diverse coverage mechanisms in place, private plans, Medicare, Medicaid. They'll all have different data needs. So things we might do, just as an example here, perhaps we'll place some of those registration programs in what I call microenvironments, such as Kaiser Permanente, Geisinger Clinic, and so forth, where we can sample every single patient transaction that takes place for that orphan disease space. Or maybe when we enroll patients in our registration program, we embed in the informed consent an optional ability to do a claims-based analysis on every patient that happens to have enrolled in our trial. Or maybe we take the individuals who screen fail, and in some diseases, unfortunately, there are quite a few, and we enroll them in a tandem longitudinal observational study to look at healthcare utilization and transitions in care in people who are approximately the same as those that we had in our program. Now, in this particular disease, one of the things we would pivot on would be hospitalizations, confirmed acute exacerbations. Notice how we would go out for 1 year here. The episode of care in this particular entity is not simply the episode for which we are gathering data for registration. The episode of care commonly goes far beyond the event that we're basing evidence of efficacy and safety on. And finally, a publication strategy to complement the approval. Now, for those of us that have been in the vineyard for many years, we recognize that this is important to enhance physician awareness and product adoption. But a much more nuanced and multivariate would be to influence the opinion of different types of payers with high-quality, peer-reviewed publications which will complete a mosaic of data that is required by a very complex environment. So some of our general strategies in the orphan disease development might include this. First, if we're having this discussion after filing, it's way too late. We've lost an opportunity to generate the type of data that I've been speaking to. Questions like, did you include patients in your registration program in the deep end of that swimming pool? These are the individuals with concomitant medications, concurrent illnesses that are driving much of the utilization in each of these disease states. People that we prototypically exclude from many of our proof of concept studies and even registration trials. Where'd you do those studies? Practice topology is a significant prognostic factor. And where we do this study frequently is as important as the nature of the study. A common sentiment that we will encounter in this activity is, don't show me the model, show me the data. I know my cost. So where we do the study is equally as important as to the design of the study. Did you measure outcomes, or was it only measures? And the difference is immense. Did we, in fact, affect core components of clinical care as part of the matrix of measures that we might look at? Did you look at interaction effects? And by here, I do not mean the biostatistical interactions that we're all familiar with. I mean, in plain language, how does the new therapy interact and play with ongoing therapy, which may be somatic or non-somatic? As an example, if you had an orphan drug that would enhance cognitive capability, would that also facilitate rehabilitative efforts for that patient and interaction effects, system effects? And the bottom line would be the need to join hands with our colleagues in epidemiology to create a portfolio of observational studies that would proceed in tandem to our typical interventional trials, and all the way producing a publication package that would begin with the first-in-human studies, designed to inform patients, family members, physicians, but also designed to enable responsible decision-making by those in the community that have the responsibility to influence patient access. With that, everyone, on behalf of WCT, we thank you for your attention. We hope that it's been informative, and we are open, of course, to receiving questions. Now, we have quite a number of questions that we have received. I'll just mention one, and Sally, if you could take this one, please. The first is, where are the regulatory challenges? Is there an evolving landscape that we need to be cognizant of? And is it different in the EU versus the United States?
Thanks, Mike. Well, there are various regulatory challenges. I think initially starting off with the study design, the lack of appropriate endpoints, the lack of controls, the statistical considerations all pose challenges for regulators. In addition, typically in orphan disease studies, you come across limited preclinical data that's available, especially in terms of safety pharmacology and carcinogenicity studies. From a CMC standpoint, adequate pharmaceutical development or lack of it is an issue. Lack of in-depth stability studies and reference standards, all of this make it particularly challenging to regulators to review and approve. Of course, again, with limited expertise in particular orphan diseases, it can be quite difficult across the board. Comparing the US with the EU, for instance, apart from the study design aspect, I think there's one item that also can create some challenges, and this is in relation to compassionate use. So there are differences in the regulations and the legislative environment across the EU and the US with regards to extended access versus compassionate use, exempt medicines versus patients on a named basis, and how you address that within the initial protocol and manage that is also one of the hurdles that I'd probably highlight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. And Barry, I have one for you. We use the expression hub and spoke operational solution in orphan disease. What is that exactly for the benefit of our listeners?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So really that is a method of recruiting where you have a KOL, perhaps, that has access to perhaps a few patients at his site, again, stipulating that these patients are often spread far and wide. And this KOL in his particular country has worked with, let's use Italy as an example, because we have some recent experience in the last few years in a similar instance where there was a KOL that was in Rome, and he had a partner physician that was in Venice that had access to a couple of these patients, and we were able to bring them into the central location for participation in the study. And again, that could be applied throughout the country, and that's essentially what we're speaking of when we talk of the hub and spoke method for recruitment in particular. I hope that answers.
I would also add, Barry, that's a great description. I would also add at the feasibility stage and at the initial stages of protocol design development and things like that, using that hub and spoke is very important, particularly when it comes to the KOLs. We want to work side by side with that KOL to help spread the message to the local investigators and physicians and people within the network. So we use that not only for patient recruitment, but also for protocol development and to gain buy-in for the study as a whole.
Thank you so much. Here's one that I'll take. It has to do with sponsoring, supporting patient associations in the various methods by which that can occur. One of the nicest ideas that we think is absolutely invaluable to do this well is to support the patient organizations by involving them in discussions on the experimental design. As Barry alluded to, we know an awful lot about the disease, but we frequently do not understand the illness. And the distinction is key. The disease is the label, the illness is the experience. In pharma, what we need to appreciate, particularly in these difficult cases, the difficult to find and even more difficult to treat patients, is exactly what are the design elements that will facilitate participation. So number one, involvement and participation in the design elements of the study. Assistance, number two, assistance and feedback during trial conduct. What's working, what isn't working well. And number three, the ancillary support mechanisms, which may or may not be financial, to support awareness for the given disease. Another question we saw here that I think is kind of neat because it expands every possible area. What improvements are needed in trial design, execution, and marketing to enable orphan disease research? Well, any one of these would push the envelope, in my opinion. I'll take this one, and others please chime in. One of the exciting things about working in rare and orphan diseases is the ability to be very innovative. With relatively few patients who have difficult illnesses to manage, the ability to reach into a portfolio of different trial designs and push the envelope in terms of how these studies are done is key. Execution, Barry, as you've alluded to, the need to include families. Jeff, cultural awareness. And Sally, what I would think is an evolving regulatory climate is key. And our last talk, in fact, dealt with the issue of commercialization. I don't use the word marketing. The commercialization term, I think, is better because it's more nuanced, it's more data-driven, and it's something that we as developers can influence. Great question. Another question we received here is, what are the best resources I can find for my particular disease? Jeff, Barry, did you folks have any thoughts about that one?
Yeah, I'll chime in that OrphaNet, ORPHANET, is a fantastic resource for finding out the particulars of a disease and the endpoints and whatnot. Also, the NORD, N-O-R-D website and National Organization for Rare Diseases. You can look that up on Google, obviously. They have a separate page for just about every disease you can think of, organized alphabetically on their page. Two great resources.
Jeff, here's one for you. So we talked about the physician-patient interaction. Why is it different for an orphan disease compared to a conventional disorder? What differences do you see particularly?
It's a good question, and it's because, like I had mentioned when I was talking, is the passion. Many times the physicians that are treating these rare disorders really have a passion for the disease and are amazingly educated, obviously, because they're spending a lot of time in this space. And the patient also has that same type of education along with the family and caregivers. I think that's a bridging point for them where they share, they can talk more openly than, say, maybe a rheumatoid arthritis study or something like that, where it's a little bit more global. But here they're very educated, and as I said before, some of the data is tough to get sometimes on some of the rare diseases, but once you get it, it's very rich and knowledgeable, so they're able to share that knowledge openly. And they know, the patients that is, they know that the investigator, their physician, is looking out for the best for them and always looking at cutting-edge treatments. So I think that's a good baseline for the really high level of relationship between the patients and the caregivers and the physicians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And certainly we could agree there's a question about the unique impact of rare disease on a patient. Often dealing with each disease produces an illness which is singularly unique, commonly lifelong, very debilitating, with a progressive trajectory. And from a commercial point of view, there are also spillover effects onto caregivers and family members. Spillover effect would be the impact that that illness will have on moms and dads and husbands and wives who need to manage these difficult conditions. So very much of a community-based issue. Well, I notice, everyone, it's 11 o'clock. We've completed our assignment for the day, and we appreciate the opportunity we've had to speak with you on these topics. I mentioned to the team before we began, we had so many topics, and we selected a few that we thought would be relevant. We thank you for your attention and courtesies. We look forward to speaking with you again. On behalf of WCT, thank you and goodbye.